We can. Okay.
All right.
Shall I break down the ground rules here? Okay. What is this? Well, it's not letting me spotlight my video now.
Oh, but you're on. You're on. You're already spotlighted.
Good. Okay. Hello, my name is Jordan Brinker. I'm the web marketing manager at the Bradbury Center, and I'm here to give you some rules. Please keep yourself muted throughout the lecture. If you are too rowdy, I will kick you out. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and they will be answered during the Q&A session. And with that, I will now hand you guys over to Jason Ackermann, the Bradbury Center Managing Director. And I'm going to pin his video, and it's going to take a second. I promise we will get there.
Okay.
All right, Jason, you're pinned.
Am I?
Yes.
All I see is Jordan Brinker.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
I swear. You're pinned now.
Okay. Leisha, am I pinned? Everybody see Jason now?
I don't think you are. It's on speaker view. So you're, oh, wait. You're pinned.
I'm pinned. Okay, it just took a second. There's just a slight lag then. All right. Well, I want to welcome all of you to our third annual and first ever virtual Ray Bradbury Writers Lecture, hosted by the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies and the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute. It is my honor to introduce tonight's speaker from our recreation of Ray Bradbury's basement office with entirely original artifacts. Kathryn H. Ross is an author and editor born and raised in sunny Southern California. Her debut book, Black Was Not a Label, is a collection of personal essays and poetry on racial trauma, identity, and faith. And it was released by Pronto in October 2019 to wide acclaim and enthusiasm. Ross is the founder of Created to Create, her sole I can't talk right now. Her sole proprietorship, where she offers freelance writing, editing, creative consulting, and website design services, and has worked with world-renowned religious leaders, academic professionals, and fellow freelancers and creative individuals seeking a hand in their artistic endeavors. She holds an MA in English from Azusa Pacific University, reviews poetry and essays for literary journals, Whale Road Review, and The Rumpus, respectively, and pens the monthly column on race and culture titled It Matters for Pasadena Now. Ross has appeared as a guest on Active Voice, Writers Respond podcast, New Books and Poetry podcast, Ordinary Grace, ZU Media, KBQHLA's CMTY Live, and was a speaker and reader alongside poet Douglas Manuel for Black Voices in Conversation, an event put on by Redhead Press and Pronto in June 2020. Manuel called her book a self-care kit, while others have dubbed her voice honest, willful, and strong. Also, in June 2020, Ross was the featured speaker for Creative Morning's first ever hybrid event between the LA and Boston chapters to speak on the month's theme, Insecure, and read from her memoir. She has also done spotlight readings for LA indie bookstores, Skylight Books, Book Soup, and The Last Bookstore. Her fiction, poetry, and essays have appeared in journals, Crack the Spine Literary, Split Lip Magazine, Spry Literary, Linden Avenue Literary, Fictive Dream, The Gravity of the Thing, and Sybil Journal, among many others. Dan Grossman from the IAHI writes, Ray Bradbury for Kathryn H. Ross is no ordinary science fiction writer. Of his short stories involving African Americans, she says, he writes not about us, but for us. He sees us as people. I think that's a really big deal for a writer who is writing in the 50s and 60s. Having read her poetry, essays, and short stories, Grossman also thinks that Kathryn Ross is a really big deal, and that she will be one of the most listened to literary voices of the next decade. Of her debut book, Black Was Not a Label, New Books Networks, Athena Dixon writes, through the lenses of natural hair, faith, and microaggressions, she lights a path to what it means to seek self while still honoring the past lives and what it means to seek self while still honoring the past lives, personal and historical, that connect us all. Like Ray Bradbury, in both her writing and in her personal life, Kathryn H. Ross desires and enjoys getting to the heart of relationships, stories, and people by stripping away the surface layers through contemplation, conversation, and time to reveal the inner soul. So without further ado, it's our great honor to present Kathryn H. Ross.
Hello, thank you all for being here, and thank you so much to the Bradbury Center for asking me to be the featured speaker for this lecture. If you guys know me, you know that Ray Bradbury is a major influence on me and one of my favorite authors, if not my favorite author. So this is an incredibly big deal for me. So I just want to say thank you all for, just for championing my work and inviting me here and inviting me to speak and for showing up. I really, really appreciate it. So I want to give a little background on just how Ray Bradbury has really just kind of affected me and my work and just who I am as a writer. He's always been someone that I deeply admired, someone that has always given me the drive and the feeling that I want to write and I want to make something beautiful. I will say that my first encounter with Ray Bradbury was through this book, The Golden Apples of the Sun. This was in my mother's library, as long as I can remember, really. And I was always so taken with the title. I thought it was so beautiful. And so when I was in junior high and high school, I started reading from this book and just kind of getting my feet wet about like what Bradbury was about, what he writes about, who he is. And from then on, it kind of just started this lifelong love affair, honestly. When I was a sophomore in high school, I remember reading A Sound of Thunder, where we also watched the film about time travel and how if you step on like a butterfly, it can change the entirety of the future. And that really solidified my love for Bradbury, where I just thought he is so prolific and he is just so aware of the human condition, and he writes for the human condition. He understands people and he writes for people. In my interview with Dan Grossman, when I said he understands and writes for Black people who are reading, I had mentioned that I was an English major in college. I've always loved literature, so I read a lot of classic white authors, and they haven't always treated Black people and Black stories with much respect, whereas Bradbury really has. I wrote a column as part of my Past Due Now column, and It Matters. And in that column, I wrote about how two of his stories, The Other Foot and Up in the Middle of the Air, talk about African Americans and their plight, and how Bradbury is really writing about these people in a way that sees them as people and holds their empathy and holds their humanity in his hands. And he offers it to his readers that I'm sure he knew were largely white at the time. And so just being a young Black girl reading Bradbury, he stood out to me from Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Steinbeck, all authors that I have respected and I've enjoyed, but he was one that I really fell in love with. And it has really been a huge influence on me, like my whole life. When I was an undergrad, my thesis project was on Ray Bradbury's life. It's about a 30-page paper of just how he got started and how he really revolutionized science fiction to what it is today. I really look at some of my favorite films, like Marvel films, like Captain America, things like that. And I think without Bradbury, the way wouldn't have been paved for the popularity that we see in those films and that we see in sci-fi today. So I remember I wrote this paper for him. My professor at the time, Dr. Glyer, Dana Glyer, she's one of the amazing authorities on Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And in that class, she actually gave me a piece of Bradbury's LA home. It was torn down, I believe, in 2015. And so I actually have like a brick of his house on my shelf. I also have some bookends made from the beams of his house. I have some artifacts in my home that kind of keep me connected to Bradbury. when I was in high school, he actually was at a bookstore like 5 minutes from my house, and I missed him. So I came very close to meeting him once, and it just didn't happen. So to have these artifacts in my home and like just in my possession really, really means so, so much. So I really just like, I really can't say enough how much Bradbury means to me, how important he's been to my writing, how much he's influenced myself as a writer. And also when I was in grad school, I wrote another 30-page paper on him, talking about how you can really see a lot of biblical influence in his work. Goes with saying I am a Christ follower, and so that does also really impact a lot of my work. And seeing that in Bradbury's work, even though he never professed to be any one religion, he just said he was a delicatessen religionist, or how he would just kind of pick through different religions and find things that really spoke to him. But in so many of his stories, he would speak about Jesus and the faith tradition I've always grown up in. And so that also just made me feel so much closer to him. And so, yeah, I just really have to say that Bradbury, it is a huge honor to be here. And it's really crazy how this all happened. I had written my column in Pasadena in February. By way of England, it came to the center, and we've been connected and like friends ever since in this crazy year, and just building this connection. So I just really want to say to you guys, like, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for, yeah, just keeping me around and reading my work and being so kind about it. So what I'm going to read today is from my memoir, Black Was Not a Label. You can see that. I will say that this is a memoir, so it's all nonfiction. So it's not a sci-fi book. It's not really influenced by Bradbury in a very overt way. But I will say that what has influenced me most about Bradbury, aside from the way he grasped the human condition and how he could write forward about people, is the way he writes so lyrically and poetically. I've always found his voice to be so different from the other sci-fi giants because he doesn't write in a technical way. He writes in a very soft, lyrical, human way that is so endearing and really brings the reader in, and really shows that the way he writes about these like very clinical scientific concepts he does it in such a way that anyone can relate to it. Anyone can feel humanity in sci-fi, whether we're on Earth or on Mars or anywhere in between. And so I wanted to add that into my own writing, where no matter what I'm talking about, someone can find something to relate to. I will say, publishing this book last October, I had no idea the level of racial unrest that we would be seeing in America today. So many people have picked up this book and found it and reached out to me, seeing me as an authority on racial trauma and just on racial politics right now, which is still very crazy to me, I will say. But I have seen that I do have a platform now to speak about these things, and I'm very grateful for that people are listening and wanting to learn. And so I hope that in my reading, you will see something that is accessible, something that is teaching, and something that is lyrical and poetic and not didactic, something that is, I guess, drawing you into my experience, that you can understand what I'm saying. And in turn, I can understand how someone is reading it. So I'm going to read two pieces today. The first one is called Ghost World 1 Heritage. This was first published in Spry Literary, and that was in January of 2019. I will also say I wrote this book as my capstone project for my MA program. I did not expect it to be a book. These were just a collection of essays and poetry. I was able to meet my amazing publisher through a totally different event for just like a totally different writing event. And we connected, he asked for my manuscript, and then a few months later, it was a book. And so now I have this extremely personal work just out in the world, and the response has been so amazing. So to those of you who have read Black Was Not a Label, I just want to say a very heartfelt thank you. But yes, for my reading, so I will start with Ghost World 1 Heritage. And it starts with this quote from Alex Haley, author of Roots. In all of us, there is a hunger, marrow deep, to know our heritage, to know who we are and where we have come from. Without this enriching knowledge, there is a hollow yearning. No matter what our attainment in life, there is still a vacuum and emptiness, and the most disquieting loneliness. Alex Haley. For a moment after I realized I was a living, breathing person, before I grasped the full scope of that personhood, I did not know that there was a veil between me and the world I was growing up in. What I mean is, I had no concept of Black. Now, there are times when I close my eyes and I see brown bodies hanging in trees, light skin to deep dark brown, ropes around their necks. And I watch them knowing it might have been me had it not been for the few decades between their births and mine. It might have been me, thin brown body, bruises under my eyes and ashen lips, head lolling stiff from a thick brown rope. The bones in my neck broken, pushing against my skin in grotesque iterations of how they're supposed to lay, how they're supposed to stand straight in the absence of the weight bowing me down since I passed through the womb. The understanding of my Blackness came at a time when there was already a stigma attached to the word and the description in my mind. I cannot say where or when I learned this stigma or how exactly I attached it to myself, allowed it to be attached to me. But I do remember the first thought of what and who I am, like a sudden drop on a roller coaster, stomach falling upwards in abrupt surprise, not wholly unpleasant, but not entirely welcome. As I grew and learned of bat mitzvahs, quinceañeras, and debuts, I felt an emptiness in my culture and my race. I thought of holidays and rites of passage held close by different cultures pitted against those attributed to Blacks, how our days are largely created from lack, or else markers of the end of some racial trauma. We jumped the broom because our marriages meant nothing while we were slaves. Families were ripped apart like one might separate a litter of puppies from their mother. Children spread across the country, married women raped and forced to breed to create better, stronger slaves. A worthy return on investment. We clutched Juneteenth to our chest because it's the day the white man gave us back our liberty, our humanity. Yet for years afterward, we were told where to drink, where to walk, where to sit, where to live. We were sprayed by hoses and hydrants, swept away like garbage in the streets before rising again on weary legs, hearts pounding with fear, with stalwart resolve. There is no question our celebrations and traditions are important and worthy, but I can't seem to reconcile their origins. We celebrate that we remained human when the world tried its hardest to make us believe we were not. Is that not something to celebrate? I cry and say it is, of course it is. But I cannot, will not, forget that for us, there is no celebration just for celebration's sake. Like freedom, all we hold was given by the hands of those with no right of ownership to begin with. Every piece of beauty, every accomplishment comes from a culture of sorrow, a code of deletion. Pain fuels this beauty, fuels art that contradicts the notion that we are not intelligent, innovative, creative. How many times have I heard the words, the first African American? But here I must take pause. Sudden and jarring like a slamming door or a clap of thunder, I remember being 18 and in college when African American and Black were no longer synonymous. The only brown body in the room, I tried to explain that I am not African American after being labeled as such again and again, after my professor had me say nigger, for no other reason than I should not be afraid to say it. The truth is my veins carry more white blood than Black. The genes all mixed up together, both forcefully and voluntarily. The blood of Creoles in Louisiana, of the French, of white masters. The truth is, I cannot tell you ever where I came from. I cannot tell you who my people are outside of this country. I cannot tell you what African province my ancestors shuffled forth from, driven like animals rather than walking straight backed and proud. But who could walk proudly into the hull of a ship? Who could hold their head high as they crawled atop the brown body of another before yet another brown body crawled atop them? I remember saying that I am not African American because I have never known Africa. And I remember a white boy, sickly pale with flat colored eyes, nodding at me proudly, saying that someone finally got it, that African American was only a politically correct phrase used by guilty whites and not truth. I remember looking back at him and seeing the momentary discomfort on his face as our eyes met. The disbelief I felt at his words, at his audacity to confirm my feelings and perceptions based on a politically correct technicality, washed over me. But it was strangely muted, a dulled knife with just enough sharpness to sting but leave the skin unbroken. I wondered what could have spurred him to speak, to insert himself into a space where only my voice belonged. I wondered if, in his eyes, I was the first African American to have understood this about themselves, if I was the first African American to figure it out. I think of the Great Sphinx. The why and when and how of the destroyed nose sits as a supposed historical mystery but I wonder why there is any debate at all. Is it such a stretch to think that this nose, this outlier of racial evidence, might have been destroyed to hide the truth of the civilization? Brown bodies and broad features erased from history's memory until it was normal for a young Black girl to grow up and believe the Egyptians, too, were white. I think of a video in the Southern California Natural History Museum recreating what King Tutankhamun might have looked like, my dark eyes accepting his depicted milky skin, thin lips, and pointed nose as truth and fact. I think of how this is part of our culture of sorrow, erasure of the self by the other, leading to erasure of the self by the self. How else could they justify the lie that we had subhuman intelligence, subhuman souls? How else could they enslave a people whose brown body brothers and sisters created and solved equations, who aligned the pyramids to mirror the stars? Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see brown bodies hanging in trees. I see brown bodies hanging in trees, heads bowed and chins reaching for chest, and she whispers to me, tells me not to eat the strange fruit. My mother might have worked in the house, and my father in the field, and my sister with my mother, and myself with my father, and where is my God? I inherit rage, sorrow, deletion, death. I inherit displacement, a blind woman walking with the veil like scales over her eyes. The past is cloaked in a thick pall that has me asking what celebrations might I have inherited from my people? What days, what festivals, what rites of passage are lost in the silenced annals of our murky past? It was not enough to see the lies or the way I swallowed them. It was not enough to feel simultaneous shame and pride in my body. The striking length, the beautiful texture of my hair, the self-same lightness and darkness of my skin, the thick curvature of my lips, the lift of my cheekbones, the slight arc of my brown-black eyes. Who constructed this face? From where did these features come? Who handed my eyes down to my father's parents, to my father, to me? Who gave my nose, my smile, to my mother's parents, to my mother, to me? Who were the brown bodies who lay with other brown bodies, create my grandparents, my parents, me? And who were the white bodies forcing their way into the brown bodies, into a line that might never have known them, had their ships with empty, gaping holes remained on northern shores? These white bodies loosened the coil in my hair, lightened the hue of my skin, left an inheritance of unmerited pride and shame in my body, pride and fear from my body. There is more white blood than black blood in these veins, but there are strands in my DNA woven with intention, laced with resilience and persistence. Their genetic codes buried so deeply that variations of darkened skin and coiled hair will persist forever, shaping faces and ordering cells so they recall the brown bodies taken from the shores, set to the fields, hung from the trees. I am a lost daughter calling out to distant mother, calling out to Father God, asking where I ever belonged, asking who I was supposed to be. And that is Ghost World 1 Heritage. A little background on that piece. There are actually 3 ghost worlds in my book, and the first one is Heritage, the second one is Womanhood, and the third one is Disillusionment. And I decided to read Heritage today because it is the broadest of the 3. It is one where it's not solely about myself, and it kind of opens up the reader to the plight what other brown and black people deal with in America today, and the legacy that we've come from and how we're living in the world today. So this one is really one of my favorites. It was one of my favorites to write, even though it was definitely one of the hardest to write. And I just thank you guys so much for listening. My next and last piece is called Within the Veil. This is actually the final essay of my book, and it's a lot shorter, so it shouldn't take too much time now to finish this one. But it begins with a quote from W.E. Du Bois in The Forethought of the Souls of Black Folk. Within the Veil. I who speak here am bone of the bone and flesh of the flesh of them that live within the veil. I imagine brown ancestors walking, shackled to one another at the ankles and the throat through a veil. They are coming from blazing heat and vast skies, lush trees and the smell of creation. Man first emerged here, walked upright into blinding daylight, let the sun kiss his flesh until it was baked black, smelling of fire. Negro. Brown skin, black hair, dark eyes. They are going to gray skies and rough seas, to bent backs and sweating brows, to boy, nigger, slut, missy. shackled to one another at the ankles and throat, piled one body on top of another like lumber stacked for maximum profit. The sons and daughters once held in the cradle of the tree of life, severed at the roots. As they pass the veil, it does not fall back and glide over them. It clings, draping itself over their heads, against their eyes, and in their mouths. Obscuring their vision, they move forward, shuffling from warmth into darkness, from home into diaspora, until the veil falls over the last of them, covering every last body that was, every body that is, every body that is yet to come. They are a people who have passed through but not beyond, trapped in an endless tunnel that loops back into itself, a sepulchral labyrinth. We are those from within the veil. In some attempt at understanding what I knew myself to be, I said this again and again to make sense. I am a person who happens to be Black, not a Black person. Black was not a label, but a vague descriptor, something to encompass my features, my skin, my hair, at most. Whatever a Black person was, I was not, though not because I did not want to be. I used to say that no matter what color I was, I would essentially be the same person. I would be the same person who read Harry Potter books in the summer, who felt most alive in the water. I would be the same person who was shy and quiet, who could not raise her voice higher than a baby yell, a shout of laughter. I would still listen to movie soundtracks and old rock and roll. I would still love Jesus and say my prayers each night. I would still talk clearly, enunciating my words like I was taught to in the 4th grade. There was no such thing as sounding white or being an Oreo. I was just being myself as my parents had been themselves. In the 70s, they bonded over Elton John, James Taylor, and the Jackson 5. They played records of the Beatles and Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, which they later passed on to my sister and me. In the 80s, my father studied poetry and English, and my mother biology and nursing. My father wore an afro and a jerry curl, my mother a press and a perm. They watched Pee-wee's Playhouse on Saturday mornings in the early years of their marriage and Martin on primetime. Both their families said they were a little weird, acted white. In the early 90s, they bore my sister and myself, and we heard the same things all throughout our childhood. Within this veil, there is no room for two warring souls, for a double consciousness. Everything is or it is not. I am either this or another thing entirely. Within the veil, everything is branded, stamped across the forehead with thick ink that reaches to the skin and into the brain, choking the synapses until they comply with the predisposed directive. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sign and sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. There might have been a moment when the world was not split straight down the middle, a moment before the when, where the veil fluttered momentarily and those on either side had a glimpse of what lay beyond their field of vision. For one, they saw a dark people, wrapped in an ability to forget, to loosen the past. From the other, they saw a pale, muted world, covered in a fog where shapes and shadows move about like ghosts. Scales on their eyes and cloth forced into their ears, bits in their mouths, hands shackled behind backs and souls chained to boulders, dragging them, dragging us, dragging me, down into the murky depths where the world materializes around us, both hazy and overbright, stark darkness. I hear a lone voice shouting, asking, "Hast thou seen sorrow in the dull waters of hopelessness? Hast thou known life?" And I sit on the corner of the ghost worlds, spinning themselves outward, reaching into the world beyond the veil, a world I'll never really know. I ask myself how long I'll stay here in the in-between, eyes watching the shadows that rest between myself and everything I've ever wanted, ever hoped for. I ask God the Father to meet me there, ask the Son to walk me from one corner to the other, ask the Holy Ghost to touch the veil, turn it opaque, so that I can see at least and then know. I feel his hands close over mine, the gentle pull as he brings me up to my feet and guides my weak legs, my tired brown body, on. Thank you. I will say, so this was written mostly through 2016, 2018. It just came out 2019. And as I said before, it is extremely vulnerable. It's very scary for me to share this with people. I've done quite a few readings since the pandemic happened, all virtual, and every time it's just as scary. So I want to say thank you guys for listening, Thank you for engaging and tuning in, and I will turn it over to Jordan or Jason. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Kathryn. That was absolutely wonderful. And I think there's a real power to being vulnerable that that I try to teach my students, when they're writing reflectively. And some of them are here in the audience tonight, and so they got to see that demonstrated firsthand. Yeah, that was absolutely wonderful. We're gonna open it up for Q&A in just a minute. And Jordanella or Alicia Beard is on the team here. She's going to kind of facilitate the questions and comments that are coming in. But I just want to take a minute to say this has been a wonderful event. Kathryn, thank you so much for being here. Bradbury Center wants to continue doing programs like this, and we need your help. We need your support. We've got a campaign going on right now called Forever 451. We're trying to get 451 people to chip in $100 to help the center sustain us, so that we can preserve these the wonderful collections that we've got here and continue offering programs like this. So we'll put a link in the chat, and go ahead and let the questions and comments come in. And Alicia, I'll turn it over to you so you can facilitate that.
Okay, awesome. Can everyone hear me? Can someone,
Yep.
Kathryn, can you hear me? Cool. So yeah, if everyone will start typing some questions if you have them in the chat, then I'll read those. I am gonna go ahead and start off with one. So Black was not a label. It seems so simple. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today, Kathryn. And it seems like a simple concept, but it's not. In the museum field, we're talking a lot about language and the power of words and reframing certain concepts. Slaves is an example. Instead of saying slaves, we want to say enslaved people, because they were people first. And I feel a lot of that coming through your work. And I'm wondering how you found that inspiration yourself. How did you come across this line of thought? Where did Black was not a label come from?
That's a really good question. So one of my first essays in the book is Defiance, and that was actually the very first essay I ever wrote of this project. And in that essay, I talk about a friend of mine when I was in high school who called me his Black friend when we first became friends. I talk about cutting my hair. I used to have long hair, relaxed, straightened, and how liberating it was when I finally just cut it and wore my natural hair, and how much cheaper it is to have my hair like this. And also a time in my freshman year of college at University of Laverne when I had a professor have me say the N-word in class because I was the only Black person, and he, I guess, surmised that I should not be afraid to say it. So when I was writing this Defiance in 2014, I was about 20, I think I was 20 years old, and I was operating from a place of, I don't want people to see me as a Black person. I just want them to be colorblind and see me as a person, because I had already at that point in my life had a lot of pain and just very confusing experiences with people reacting to my race. And I was thinking, I know it's an important part of me, but there's so many more things to me. Like being Black is part of it, but it's not all of me. And it seems like it's the only thing people see. So I was really pushing for people to not see that. And I was erasing myself, which led to another essay I wrote, Erasure, where I just kind of go through all of the times in my life up until I was maybe 22, 23, where I felt erased, and I erased myself because I just didn't want people to feel, I guess, uncomfortable with my Blackness. And I didn't want them to feel uncomfortable with me. And so when I was in grad school, I was reading this essay back to myself, and I realized I don't agree with anything I'm saying here. I was like, I don't agree that my Blackness doesn't matter. I don't agree that I want people to not see me that way. I don't agree that it's not important. I just kind of had this light bulb moment where I was like, my race is important to me and it should be important to others, but not to the point where it colors all of who I am. It's like, it's like, when people say I don't see color, it's like they're missing a part of you. And I know they're trying to say like, oh, I don't see that part of you, I see you as a whole person, but my color is part of who I am as a person. And so when I was reading about that essay and thinking like, wow, I really disagree with like half the stuff I'm saying in here, that was when this project came about, because I was writing essays responding to what 20-year-old Kathryn thought and how wrong she was. And so Black was not a label came up as, I guess a differentiation where I'm talking about like the friend who said, oh, you're my only Black friend. And in that way, Black should not have been a label. Like, I'm just your friend. Like, maybe you haven't had a Black friend before, but it doesn't make me any different from your other friends. And it's that very subtle difference where I'm a Black friend or I'm your friend who is Black. And I lean more towards like, I am the friend who is Black, because it still matters that I'm a Black person. I'm not hiding that, not erasing that, but it doesn't color the entirety of who I am as a friend, because you know, the things we shared, the things that we hung out with and things we, you know, enjoyed together, it was like, it transcended race, didn't matter. We both liked the Magic School Bus or Tim Burton films, just like, you know, random stuff that just anyone can like, and it doesn't have to be racialized or labeled in a way. And so Black Was Not a Label was actually not the original title of this. My editor, Dr. Michael Dean Clark, actually pulled that out when he was doing the editing process, and he was like, yeah, this is it, because it's kind of saying what I've been trying to say. Like, it is not a label, but it is. And it's this kind of dichotomy of my life where I am aware that people look at me and say, oh, that is a Black person, not a person who is Black. So that's really where this line of thought came from, where just as I got older, I couldn't ignore anymore that Black was the label people were labeling me with, and how they approached me in everything, in school, in friendships, dating relationships, everything. And so I really had to take this time to kind of reckon with that and kind of take back some agency about how I want to be seen.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. That's amazing. It's really impressive that at 23, you were able to start writing in response to your work earlier. So that reminds me of Bradbury. He also started writing young. All right, another question we have from Megan. She wants to know, in addition to Ray Bradbury, and she gathers Alex Haley, what writers and what works have influenced your writing most powerfully, and who are you reading right now?
That's another good question. This is always a hard question, because then you blank on like all the authors you love, and you know, like, I don't know who influences me.
Then you're gonna remember them all as soon as this call is over.
I will say, when I was talking to Dan in our interview the other day, I did mention Lemony Snicket was like someone who really whet my appetite to be a writer. In just like one fell swoop, those books grew my vocabulary. They gave me a love for literature. They were weird and quirky, and I was like, this is so fun. I want to do this. And I think shortly after reading Lemony Snicket is when I encountered Bradbury, and I would just kind of like was the perfect chaser to that. It was just like the perfect level up. But in addition to that, I really love Edgar Allan Poe. I really love Langston Hughes, of course. A lot of writers from the Harlem Renaissance I'm a very big fan of them. I love Zora Neale Hurston. I was scrolling on Instagram today, one of her quotes came up, and I'm just like, every time I see it, you're just, oh, she's so good. Right now, I am reading Jesmyn Ward, Where the Line Bleeds. In August, I kind of splurged and bought a bunch of books. And so I had read Sing Unburied Sing in grad school, and I loved it. So I was like, I need to read more of Jesmyn. And yes, I'm almost done with that. I'm planning on reading Salvage the Bones next. Earlier this year, or maybe late last year, I read The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. I got to meet him once. He came and did a lecture out at the Claremont Colleges. I got to see him last year. He's definitely a huge influence, because his writing is phenomenal and so honest. And that's really what I want to do in my writing. So it's really just kind of a hodgepodge of different people. I will also say like Steinbeck is one of my favorites. Edith Wharton is definitely one of my favorites. As I said, I grew up reading Harry Potter, so that was influential for me as well. And Tolkien, of course, like Lord of the Rings, is a huge fan of that as well. Yeah, I know I'm definitely blanking on people. I will say also Neville Larson. I remember reading her story Passing. It was very impactful for me because I'm not biracial, but my family, as I said, we are, very mixed up, and we've got the Creoles and, the Louisiana and all that stuff. So we're very mixed up, and there's a lot of multiracial makeup in our DNA. So when I read Passing, it just felt like such a close concept to me. And I was like, I understand this. Like, my grandmother went through this, other family members have gone through this. And so that book is something that is very important to me. But yeah, I'm definitely still blanking on people. I mean, maybe I can write out a list and send it to you guys, but for now, those are my influences. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be awesome. It's so funny. I'm not an English major. I did art history. Now I'm doing museum studies, but Jason and Jordan were. And I'm just always blown away by the amount of books that you guys have read. And then you'll be like, oh, I can't think of them all. I'm like, that's way more than I could name even on my best day. All right. Kelly would like to know, what advice do you have for writers who want to be published? What's the first step? And thank you for being here tonight.
Hey, Kelly. Yeah, I will say my publishing journey has not been traditional. When I was finishing up high school, my goal was to get an agent, and I was like not anywhere near talented enough to get an agent, or just like I just wasn't even like near that space. So I kind of put that on the back burner. My first publication was in the Pomona Valley Review in 2012, and that was I think 2 or 3 poems that I'd written, and they accepted, and that was my first time ever being published, and it was like the biggest deal of my life. And then between that and my next publication, which was Defiance in 2014, I hadn't had any. I was writing all the time. I wasn't sending things out. And it wasn't really until 2015 that I started publishing or like submitting my work, my short stories, my flash fiction, my poetry, my essays to different places, and really seeing a response. I would say like I have way more rejections than I do have acceptances. Like that's just a given. But it was like 2015 when I started to put my work out there more and get more recognition. I had a writing group in college, and we kind of like pushed each other to submit all the time. Whenever we would get an acceptance, we would had a group chat, and we were like, acceptance, and all like capital letters. And so that was kind of where I started my publishing journey, and just kind of like amassing works in different journals and zines and zines. And that's kind of how this came about. In 2018 and 2019, I was working at Red Hen Press in Pasadena as an editorial intern. So I was on the other side of the publishing wall and like working with authors, and I absolutely loved it. And I was thinking, by that time I had finished my thesis. I was thinking, if I were to publish this summer, I guess I would send it to Red Hen and we'll see. But I never did that. So some of the essays, maybe like 6 of the 11 or 12 essays in here were published by different journals. And so by the time I encountered my publisher, at the time, Pronto, my publisher, didn't exist. It was just this guy, Trevor, my friend. And we met at an event for the 1888 Center in Orange County, which I think is called Heritage Future now. And so it was really just, I made a connection with this person in the literary world. When he started his publishing press, he was like, hey, do you have anything you're working on? I sent him my thesis. I didn't even know he had a publishing house yet. And he read it and he was like, hey, I'm starting a house. Do you want to be my first author? And so that's just kind of where it came from. Like I don't have an agent still. I didn't have an agent. So it wasn't like someone was like putting my stuff out there for me. It was just me kind of hustling and submitting to different journals and things, getting a lot of rejections and then getting some acceptances, which were always very welcome. I made my website around 2016 where I just had I listed all of my publications. So people were like, oh, here it is, you can see it. And yeah, it was really just putting my work out there and then just having, certain connections, and then the rest was like serendipity, I guess. So I would say the first step is just like put your work out there as much as you can and have an online presence so people can find you. That's really basically what I did.
That's awesome. And that's really fascinating that you were you had like a writing group. Bradbury talked about that a lot as well. He constantly was joining a new group or had friends that he was talking about stuff with, and kind of the same thing, just like constantly putting stuff out there. When I was reading Dr. Eller's first biography about Bradbury, I asked Jason, I was like, how is he not getting discouraged? Like, it sounds like there was just overwhelming rejection at first.
Oh my goodness, yes.
So yeah, just keep at it. And that's what Bradbury would say too, write every day and don't stop. We have another question from John. He said, thank you for sharing your writing and time with us. What mediums and pieces outside of literature have influenced you in your personal growth?
Oh, that is a very good question as well.
And I know you created the cover.
I
right?
did, yes. That is my own design.
I don't know if they can see. So yeah, what kind of mediums and pieces of art outside of literature have influenced you?
I will say that I've always loved art. When I was a kid, I was pretty sure I was going to be an artist. And then I thought I would be a marine biologist. And then I landed on writer, which I feel is really my calling. So I was kind of all over the place. But some advice a friend gave me a few years ago was, when you're having writer's block, to just consume. And so that means watch television, watch movies, read a lot of books, look at art, go to a museum. And I have like taken that and really run with it because it's so true. And so when I think of other things that have influenced me, I do think of some of my favorite films. Like, for example, Edward Scissorhands is one of my favorite films of all time. So I've definitely kind of tried to capture that very soft, kind of quirky vibe in some of my work. As I said, I love Edgar Allan Poe. So when I would read him, I would think, how could I write something that's creepy and weird, but very literary as well? But it's not so much a piece or a movie or anything. It's just like, I just kind of consume all these things and just kind of like hold them in my chest and let them ruminate and just kind of, marinate, which is when my publisher lets to let things marinate for a while. And then it just kind of like comes up. Like, for example, one of my favorite short stories that I've written, because it's so weird, is called The Healthiest Place on Earth. And it's about a mental illness themed theme park. And I just wrote that because I'm in therapy. So it's like, I've struggled with anxiety. I've been to therapy, and I was like, what if there was a place where it was just like based on these issues that people deal with? And yeah, I wrote it in like a couple hours in a single day after months of writer's block, and it got published like 2 days later. And I was like, this is awesome. And it came from just, something that was just going on in my life. I will say I do have a big influence in like a lot of cartoons and anime. I know that a lot of people are always kind of like shocked by that. I know you love that. Because I just think cartoons today, they are so well written. The stories are so strong. And then people look over them because they're like, oh, those are for kids. And some cartoons are like that. But like what I'm thinking of is Over the Garden Wall, which is like one of my favorite miniseries just in life. I just love it so much. I will show you this because I made it for Halloween a couple years ago. But yeah, Over the Garden Wall is one of my favorite stories, and it's a 10-episode miniseries that aired on Cartoon Network in 2014. And the story is so beautiful. The story is so strong and so poignant. And I'm just thinking, like, there is so much fodder in these shows. Like, you kind of look at things when we were kids or when I was a kid to things that are like for kids now, and the writers behind them, the artists, the creators, they are like really capturing the human spirit, the human condition, human crises, and they just kind of put it all out there. I know like there was one cartoon on Cartoon Network that I think it just finished, and its series finale was literally about PTSD and like dealing with your trauma. And I was just like, that's just amazing. And so many people would write it off because it's a kid's show. Like they're not dealing with anything important, but it's not true. And so I have a lot of influences from like modern cartoons from when I was a kid, different animes. I often say that Yu Yu Hakusho is my favorite anime. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it or seen it. It's pretty old, but it is amazing. It's on Hulu if you want to watch it. But it's just the writer, I know I'm going to butcher his name if I try and say it right now, but the writer, he just is amazing in how he does story arcs and how he builds characters and how he gives them their life. And so when I'm sitting there watching an episode of anime, or when I'm sitting and watching like Pirates of the Caribbean, which I was watching the other weekend, I'm absorbing and I'm learning like storytelling techniques as well. So yeah, I wish I had more art pieces I could name and just say like, yes, this art piece that I know from this artist, but again, I'm kind of blanking on that.
No, I think that cartoons and anime are a form of art. And like you said, yeah, a lot of people don't see them that way, but they're Over the Garden Wall I just watched for the first time last year. And I was so excited to rewatch it again this fall because it's like all about autumn. So.
Yes, it's like the perfect time of year for it right now. It's just such a good story. It's so well written. Like it could be put into a book and probably be a bestseller, but no one would know because it's like, oh, it's for kids. No one thinks about that. So
absolutely.
Yeah, just consume all you can.
Jordan wants to know, do you have any current projects in the works?
I do. So I am tentatively working on a collection of short speculative fiction. It's like a collection of just short stories that are all connected very loosely. So I'll have like one character who's like maybe mentioned in another story, and I'm just kind of trying to pull that together. I have, I think 3 of those stories finished, like the first drafts finished. And I wish I had more done during quarantine because I've had so much time to write, but you know, it's kind of hard to get in that headspace when you're also dealing with the pandemic and the election and everything.
If all you come out of quarantine with is your poem Pandemic Skidoo, then you've done more than most of us have. I was just sharing it with Jordan before, and she teared up. That was so on your website, you said that a lot of people tell you that they get tearful when they read your works, and I can confirm I am also one of those people, and so is Jordan. So what's that like as a writer? Do you ever get tearful with your work, writing or reading it after?
Definitely, yeah. Writing is definitely part of my emotional processing. So there is a lot, like I've cried through things. There's a lot that I've, it's just, there's a lot to sort through in life anyway. And so writing is one of the ways that I do that. And sometimes I'll find something from like years ago and I have like no memory of it. And I'll be reading it and then it just stops. I'm like, well, what happens next? Like, what was I going through? Like, what is that? And so now I try to like do a better job of finishing my things, even if I'm not going to do anything with them, just for like future Kathryn in case she comes back and I'm like, whoa, what was she going through? But yeah, I don't know if I've ever, I've definitely had pieces that I've cried while writing them, but I don't think I've ever had one where I went back and read it and was like put back in that place and I wanted to cry again. But I do remember very clearly how I felt when I was writing them. So it is a very emotional space for me and definitely something that is part of like my personal therapy. So yeah.
That's awesome. We have another one from Pambanas. They ask, do you read stories written by Afrofuturists? If so, who is your favorite artist and why? Have you written any stories of future possibilities?
I actually have not read anything. I haven't read anything widely from Afrofuturists, but I do think that genre is amazing and it's something I want to get into a lot more. I think it's super cool that it's taking science fiction and really pairing it up with a race that's often left out of science fiction. I have written stories of like future possibilities. Like when I first started wanting to be a writer, I wanted to just be a sci-fi writer. Like that's just what I wanted to do. So a lot of my early work, there are 3 stories in particular I'm thinking of that are all connected-ish. And like you can read them in any order. And they're basically about like Earth is gone, people are on Mars now, and then Mars is about to be destroyed, and so they're leaving. And I was really trying to like pull a Bradbury in that story where the story goes that there's a man and his wife and they're like the last to leave Mars and they're like, there's nowhere else to go though. So they're just getting on a rocket and like hoping for the best. But the thing is that the man was only with the woman because he was lonely. And so now she's pregnant and he's like trapped in this relationship. And they're stuck on a rocket together going off to who knows where, and then he kind of snaps. And then I have like another story where I'm like talking about this person who may or may not be the baby they had on another planet growing up, and then like learning what happened to his parents. And when I look back on that, I'm like, it's very dark, kind of violent, but I guess that's how I was like, I was channeling Bradbury and Edgar Allan Poe, and that's what came out of it.
I was going to ask if as a writer you do that. I'm not a writer, but it fascinates me that Bradbury would literally sit down and try to channel one of his favorite authors and try and write something in their style. And as someone who was not an English major, I just can't even comprehend that that's something possible to do. So
I've never tried to like sit in the headspace of being the person, but I've definitely like had to sit in in like kind of the presence they create after you read one of their stories and think like, what can I like make out of this influence right now? Like what kind of weird, creepy thing can I write
that's so
feels
cool.
like Poe or feels like Bradbury? So that was awesome. What I came up with when I was like, I think I was still in high school when I was writing those, and they're very, very dark. So, but there's also like, just earlier this year, I wrote, the importance of race in the future for my Pasadena Now column. And that's where I mentioned Bradbury and his works about Black people in the future, and how just how it's important for us to see Black people in the future, because so often they're left out of science fiction films. If they are in those films, they often are the first to die. Like I'm thinking of not Deep Impact, but there's maybe it is Deep Impact. There's some film where it's like astronauts go up and then the one Black astronaut is like the first and only one to die. And I was like, really? So that's like often a trope in films where if they do have people of color, they're not really like invested in. Whereas you look at things like Star Trek and you see Uhura and she was like a full-fledged character. And it's so important for people to see this professional Black woman in some distant future, just living her life and like free from what we're dealing with today, like the racism and this, stigma and the stereotyping. And that's all to say like that when I do write futuristic stories, I do want to have like very diverse characters, and I do want to write in a way that's like, we all get to survive together in the future. Like we're there too, and we're also thriving.
That's awesome. Okay, so I am just having a fantastic time. I feel like when Jennifer Lawrence got to interview Kim Kardashian, that's how I feel right now. She was very excited. I'm very excited. I'm having a great time. It is 8:01, so I'm going to look to Jason. Do you want to wrap things up? We do have a few other questions. We should probably wrap things up, right? That's how these things go.
This is going really well. If we want to go for a couple more minutes and take a couple more questions, that's fine. It's really up to Kathryn. Kathryn, let us know when you get tired.
I'm good. I'm just like, I'm good. So
okay,
whatever is in the best interest of your time. I did see a question that got missed. Where is it? This one from Alexis Bragg saying, that's my cousin. Okay. I would like to answer her.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally missed that one. Good catch. Alexis asked, how do you decompress from the trauma of being Black in America? Or can you?
I don't know that we ever can really fully decompress from it, because it's like, we live in the skin, we can't leave it. But there are moments where like when I'm taking a bath, or I'm watching a movie I really love, or I'm in my bed reading a book, where it's like you can be in that space where you just forget and you're just yourself, and you're in a space where you don't have to think about how others see you. You don't have to think about how others might hate you, how others might dehumanize you, because it's just you alone. And I also feel that when I am with people who understand, it really kind of takes that away. I definitely feel that way when I get together with my family, because you just have that rapport and you all know each other and you have grown up and you have similar experiences, especially if you're a family of color. But it's not just people of color. Like I have white friends who I feel like I can just be my total self with, and they don't they don't put anything on me. I don't put anything on them. Other friends of color as well, because they, it's not the same, but they get it as well. They get, the different stereotypes and stigmas that happen in American society. And we can have very honest conversations about those things, and especially when they happen sideways, when we do them to each other, because that does happen. But I think just like finding spaces to be alone and to just be yourself and to know who you are, like to know your identity. Like as a Christian, I would say my identity in Christ is always very strong for me. So like if I can just like be in a space where I'm praying, I just feel like I know who I am and it doesn't feel as heavy. Other times I'm like, God, what the heck? Like, why did you let all this happen? It's so tiring to deal with. But there's also those moments of peace where it's like, well, even though this is incredibly exhausting, like I still know who I am and I can rest in that. So I would say that's kind of what I try to do to decompress from the trauma, just taking time to just be, and also seeking out people who understand, no matter what color they are.
It's very powerful. Thank you for sharing. We'll have one last question. Lorna asked, do you journal? I often write thoughts and scriptures, but date them. Later, while searching for something, I run across things I've written and it turns into an emotional moment.
Yeah, I have a whole bookshelf, like a whole shelf of my bookcase is to all of my old journals. So I definitely do. When I was younger, I had this like delusion of grandeur that people would be reading my journals at some point in the future. So I was very detailed about what I was like, yeah, and then John walked up and he's this guy from this class, and I would be like super detailed, and it's exhausting writing that way about your own thoughts. So I was like, okay, you know what? You just have to stop. And if these are somehow picked up in the future, they'll figure out who's who. So I definitely just, when I stopped writing like that and I go back and I read things from like when I was in high school or early college, there's always an element of embarrassment because I'm just like, oh, that's such an awkward time. But then also there are some entries where I do look and I feel like that was so real, or I forgot about that, or there's something I was praying about and I was like so crushed and hurt and sad about it. And I look back and I'm like, that's not even a thing in my life anymore. And just kind of like looking at those receipts of, how moving forward and staying in prayer can really be life-changing, and how just continuing to move forward when you feel like giving up is always the best option, because you just do not know what's coming. You don't know what's going to come. Like 10 years ago, I would not think I'd have a book at age 26. I just would not have thought that was possible. So, and if I had given up, it wouldn't have been possible. So I definitely do journal, definitely do look back and just think, oh, you poor child, you're so sad and angsty. And then other times I think, oh, that's, that was a hard thing. And, I'm glad you made it through that. And yeah, definitely part of my process as well.
Okay, well, awesome. Thank you so much for being here today, Kathryn. Thank you for everybody that came. Her website is Speak the Right Language, like WRITE. And once again, her book, Black is Not a Label. Everybody go buy it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, thank you all for attending. This was a great event. Really appreciate Kathryn Ross being here, and wish you all the best. Stay safe and warm.
Thank you, everyone. God bless.